This is Brass Tactics, policy and strategy for the people, not the politics. Welcome back to Brass Tactics, your one-stop shop for all things strategy and war, and maybe some other things here and there. We're not the most organized bunch. This week, well, Pete, you can go ahead and just get your apology out of the way now.
I need to apologize to one of our most dedicated listeners. Oh yes, I need to apologize for mislabeling the actual author of the Mastering Commander trilogy. Well, not series. It's Patrick O'Brien, not Bernard Cornwall.
Who's Bernard Cornwall? Is he the
Bernard
midshipman
Cornwall,
hornblower guy?
no, he wrote the Sharp series, which is another Napoleonic one.
Well, alrighty then. Also,
Horatio Hornblower was Cecil Forrester, but he was
so
quite a bit earlier. Hornblower was written, I think, in like the mid 1900s.
this week we don't have too much new in the way of current events, and we have spent a lot of time talking about cool things happening with drones, especially in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So I thought I would take a step back and do a little bit more military theory, since it's been a while since we touched this one. And so this week we were just gonna go through the principles of war real quick. Where did they come from? Where did they go?
Where have you been to?
Principal-eyed Joe.
Heck if I know. So the principles of war, like a lot of these other things we've talked about, for those of you who have listened more than once and are still listening after this very belabored introduction, we've talked about things like revolutions in military affairs was one of the big ideas. The idea that warfare progresses in these technological leaps and bounds almost, and that technology and new strategies interact and change each other. We've talked about how much I don't like the theory of realism. And then we've talked about some of the folks that really laid the foundation for military theory. Karl von Clausewitz, things he wrote in his On War. Baron Antoine de Jomini, the contemporary to Clausewitz, who also wrote a lot, and we talked about Sun Tzu. So these guys' writings, combined with sort of, is it common sense, or is it just like generational experience, sort of lessons learned from history combined to this day, we have what we call the principles of war. And they're like the laws of war, the same way that gravity is considered a law of nature almost. These things are considered fact, like immovable requirements, and they will either help you in your conflict or they will significantly harm you. And with that being said, Pete, why don't you pick a favorite one, and we'll just go around the circle here.
I like Sun Tzu's principles.
Oh, we're not going to use the U.S. Army ones, Pete?
No, we're using the U.S. Army ones.
Oh, but I really want to talk about heaven and earth and the moral law. Why not really quick? Because we could pull them out. Because I mean, the U.S. Army is
He
not
doesn't
making
call
these
them
out of thin air.
principles. He calls them 7 elements, anyways.
Oh, the five elements of war, man. Because he's referring to the 5 classical elements. So elements and principles, elemental principle, right? They're the baselines, the formative things that you have to take into consideration.
You're stretching, but go for it, Pete.
Alrighty. As I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's the moral law, which is the highest principle of war, which is essentially the authority, I think, as I interpret it, the authority the commander has over his
I gotta
subordinates.
pull up my free version. He lays it out in the first 2
does.
chapters.
He starts it out
just like
the imperial examinations.
All right, keep going.
So the moral law, the authority, aka the authority that the commander has over the subordinates, which you could interpret it as unity of command. Then you have heaven, which is, I believe, the things you cannot control, the weather, the chaotic element, as Clausewitz would say. Then earth, which is the terrain, so decisive terrain, key terrain. Then the commander himself, and then method. So the commander and then the discipline, the method that he then extends his command out through the troops.
Yeah, those don't line up with the principles of war that we were going to talk about today.
Well,
And
yeah,
here's why.
at least he's trying to tell you
Here is
something.
why. No, he tells us something very informative, and it has a direct analog to today. But what Sun Tzu, because remember, stripping everything away, Sun Tzu writes for a warfare that was much more simple than what we have now. And
Mhm.
in that simplicity, he has parsimony, so he can tell us the stuff that really does matter. And the problem with that is the lack of complexity. Strategy and tactics really are not words that really distinguish themselves in Sun Tzu. Like one is part of the other, etc. And so these five things that you list, those really equate to what we would consider mission variables, or MET-TC is what the
Mm.
Army likes to throw around. So, what your mission is, what your enemy has, time considerations, terrain and weather considerations, and other environmental and civil considerations. So, these are all the things that you have to take into account once you're on the ground. And so I would agree that since these principles are still very much relevant and that we've repurposed them, but I don't think they really line up with the principles of war. The principles of war, I'd feel like Jomini and Clausewitz are a little bit closer,
Mhm.
and Jomini more so, because Jomini is very much trying to write a science for warfare. It's like applying the scientific method to the study of war. And that's really what the principles of war are trying to emulate. All right, so you drop a ball, it falls at the exact same speed every single time because of the law of gravity. Similarly, you mass your forces, so I'll just start with mass.
Okay.
The more people you have, the more likely you are to win. It's just one of the principles. You cannot, there are ways to mitigate the advantage that somebody has by having a vastly superior number of forces to you, but ultimately, the size of somebody's military force has to be contended with one way or another.
Alright. Before actually we jump into the definitions though, could we really quick lay out the preferred mnemonic and also what the 9 principles are for the
They
audience?
change it all the time, but it was Moose Muss for me, and it's still Moose Muss now.
Moose Moss?
Moose Muss.
Muss.
Moss Moose?
I thought it was Moss Moose.
I thought it was Moss Moose.
Yeah, that's how I learned it.
But it's Moose Muss or Muss Moose, but it's definitely a muss because it's mass. Oh, now I'm already drawing a blank. Oh
Oh, right,
gosh.
it's Moss Mouse. That was what it was, you were messing me up.
Yeah,
Right, 'cause
you can
there's
do
a
a
U in there for,
mouse is
unity of
acceptable.
command.
Mass, your objective, your offensive, surprise, economy of force, maneuverability, unity of command, security, and simplicity. So I learned it as Moose Muss. Mouse Moss, Moss Mouse, all of these things work, whatever really floats your boat. Ultimately, there's 9
Or
fun
Sumo Moses, my
so
favorite.
these principles of war, you could think of them as like the laws of war, and there's 9 of them, and they interplay and connect with each other. But ultimately, when you describe how somebody beat somebody else on a battlefield, or how somebody won a campaign, or why another side lost a war, you can end up talking about it using these principles of war, these laws of warfare.
When you go back and edit it, I'd like you to put a Japanese kabuki shout when Matt says "Sumo Moses." Just
So
"Yo!"
I put I tried a sound effects for brass tickets. I tried to put the film roll. Yeah,
Did you not find
but no,
a royalty-free one?
I did. I had to make an account and like everything, and then my algorithm canceled it when I ran it through the cleanup, and
What?
I was too tired to try and unjigger that.
Next time, we'll just do it with our mouth noises then.
Maybe because the other problem is
Copyright this.
the AI really doesn't like the pitch and timbre of Matt's voice specifically.
For some reason. Don't know, it just hates me.
It comes after you and it makes you sound like an auto-tuned robot just
It's messed up.
because of where your bass range already is and the cadence at which you speak. it chops you up like a robot. So I have to get creative before I apply because I'm not smart enough to overcome other audio technical difficulties. But with your financial support, we could probably update our equipment and make something happen. But so
Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Mass is your first one, and it's also one of the most straightforward.
Well, so who would be the first guy to talk about the decisive point? Is it Jomini? Because that's really what mass is, right? Throwing the mass of your forces upon the decisive point.
I don't think it's
I'd put a
quite
pin in
that. I
that.
mean, yes, to say it's a place and time and synchronizing the elements of combat power, but it's also about massing effects rather than just concentrating forces.
Yeah, and if to keep in like the sort of vein of scientific theory terms, if these principles are the laws of the science of war, then the decisive point is one of the theories to it. In theory, you can apply effort through these 9 laws of warfare at this area to make it crumble. But there's a few other ones that come into play too. So like the next one on the list, the next one on the classic ROTC list that I learned it from in Moose at least is objective.
Mhm.
What was the mission you were given? What does that terrain look like? You can have a great strategy, but if it's aimed at a terrible objective, you're going to have a terrible outcome. Or if you sort of have an aimless objective, you are going to the wheels are going to fall off, and you're going to end up in World War I style trench warfare with FPV drones like Ukraine and Russia have currently found themselves in. Because there was clearly strong objectives on the Russian side at the start, but they had not anticipated the resistance that they met. And then everything has sort of come to a stalled point here for a little while.
Well, I would say also, I mean, following down that, I'd say the cardinal. We can actually look at this because we can now use the principles of war to execute kind of a post-mortem, especially of failed military campaigns. It's a lot harder to kind of point out what went well in a successful campaign because everything kind of just becomes like, oh yeah, look how great we are, and pat each other on the back. Kind of like why the U.S. Army is so unwilling to move on from World War II. But you could then use, like I said, the principles to say what went the most wrong in 22 for the drive on Kiev. And I would say it was probably lack of unity of command because the Russians had 3 discrete theater commanders, 4-star generals coming in from 3 different axes, and then lack of economy of force of the 2 principles.
All right, well,
They did not.
let's
ahead,
unpack
sorry.
those next 2. No, I was just gonna say let's
Yeah.
unpack those next 2 now,
Mhm.
because unity of command is it sounds simpler to folks that have had to deal with it, but I feel like that one and economy of force are probably 2 of the more vague concepts in the principles.
I was going to say what's plagued every operation since the end of the Gulf War: objective. What is the objective?
What's the
That's what
exit strategy? That's what we
Not
really.
even the exit strategy. What are we trying to do in the
That's-
first place?
So
You could argue that for the Russian invasion of Ukraine of 22, and it's hard because they kind of change the goalposts as they go on. After they lose, like this little Kharkiv offensive they've done this spring was originally supposed to take Kharkiv, and
No,
now
bro, it's a feint.
no,
It's
it's
a feint.
It's
It's
feint.
total.
We're
It
just
was
creating
always a
breathing
feint.
space.
No, you are reading NATO propaganda.
It's the same thing about Kiev in 22, though. Oh, no, we didn't try to land a whole VDV division next to Kiev. That was just a feint, you know? We didn't have 16 IL 76s in the air above
I
Belarus
blame
ready to
computers.
go. We were just waiting.
I truly blame computers. Objective sounds like something that should be simple, but if you do not have like a specific objective, like what is the acronym? SMART, specific, measurable, applicable, relevant and timely, or whatever. Achievable, relevant, like if you don't have a very clear and concise objective, it really doesn't matter what you do. And computers are not capable of coming up with nuanced objectives. And so this feeds back into my whole gripe about the autonomization of warfare, is that we offload strategy to these war games and then we manipulate the war
Well,
games.
that and we handwave logistics, when in
And
reality, if you kill the enemy's logistics, you win the fight. It's pretty
exactly.
simple.
There's
If the Russians invaded along the border with Belarus and staged an amphibious landing in Odessa, doesn't matter the losses they would have taken. If they can't get reinforcements or arms from the rest of NATO in the West, they're done.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I mean,
I
you
wonder
could
if
look
that
at
also.
U.S. for
So would you say that's kind of actually execution by wargaming? Is it also like it's like planning by committee as well, isn't it? Where it's like you're spreading your objectives out to try to match as many either politically acceptable outcomes as possible, like hedging your bets.
You're literally compromising it, which compromise sounds like you've reached a deal with somebody else, but it can also be used as like a structural accusation, right? Like this
Hmm.
objective has been compromised, which
Or
ties into one of the ones you brought up, unity of command, right? That is another way you can pick too many objectives, which would require you to have too many different command nodes to go after all at once, which is essentially dividing up your chain of command. You're the the or planning by committee, like you said, right? So having one commander makes things very, and this is one of those weird things where the military works so different in a democracy from its actual democracy where everybody's equal. Because in the military, it's like, no, you have a commander. That commander, what that commander says, as long as it's not immoral, unlawful, or unethical, you will do it, and you should do it fairly quickly. And because if you cannot act quickly, and if you cannot act in a unified manner, you cannot use the mass of your forces to your advantage to attack your objectives. And I'd tie in more principles, but we haven't talked about them yet.
And I like where Pete was going with the wargaming because honestly, I feel like we hand wave wargaming too often. I mean, you can go all the way back to Millennium Challenge if they'd actually
oh,
run the war
the
games.
notorious.
The notorious
Yeah.
Millennium Challenge. So, background for our listeners: Millennium Challenge was a war game that the DoD ran over 20 years ago, and more or less they hired an asymmetric thinker to be the Op 4, who promptly basically broke the war game by doing all sorts of things like kamikaze attacks, not like we've seen kamikaze drone attacks recently, denial of services, cyber attacks, more or less suicidal attacks in a lot of ways, but it broke the blue force, and he was playing the red force. Blue force being the good side, red force being the bad side in the war game. And instead of accepting the results and saying, "Wow, we've got a lot we can unpack here. This is great," they said, "No, no, no, no. You cheated. Even if you didn't break the rules, you cheated. You're going to play within these parameters and only do these things, and we're going to make up even more rules for you. That way, we can prove the outcome that we already predetermined."
We're gonna talk about this practically every episode. We're gonna bring up this Millennium Challenge thing because it's true too. Because
Hmm.
the other thing is that's how they program AI as well. You tell AI what the right answer was. You even can make up scenarios and then tell the AI what the answer was. And now the AI is like, it's like a 5-year old. It's like, okay, I believe you. I trust you. All right, that's the answer now, and that is the answer that I will regurgitate every single time.
I
So
mean, think about
you
yeah, when you're
basically
putting
gaslit your own computer into lying to you about the outcomes for strategic scenarios.
when you as a programmer or a developer are putting so much time and effort into making this either war game, AI, whatever have you, you don't want to hear it give you back contrary information. You want it to provide a positive feedback loop to what you're doing. Otherwise, all the effort you put in was wasted. This is a very obvious human bias that we all have. But whatever. That's the whole. It's like the whole point of you're supposed to not do that, especially while wargaming. It's supposed to give you contrary information so you can make adjustments.
So that's really good coverage for our first three. We've got mass, we've got objective, and we've got unity of command. So I guess we're doing mouse
We'll
Well,
month.
do
I was
now.
actually going to go surprise because if we're talking war games, you're
Yeah.
always going to have surprise
I mean,
Hmm.
things. You want to be the one giving the surprises, not the one being surprised. And there's a little thing that they talk about there in the Army's, principles of war called deception, which we've apparently completely forgotten about. But there's a lot of deception going on in Ukraine now. If we're going to draw an analog to a current conflict,
Hmm.
they're making wooden cutouts of vehicles and howitzers and everything else and using them as targets to expend enemy precision guided munitions and to confuse enemy forces. It's
Yep.
a ruse as old as time. Hannibal did it to the Romans.
And for lack of surprise and the terrible consequences, you have the failed Ukrainian summer offensive of last year, of
Oh gosh,
2023, when
yes.
they telegraphed openly for political purposes, the intended counterattack, probably mainly for Western appetite. Because I'll tell you, I was in Estonia in June of that year, right before they launched the attack, and Estonian TV had a special offensive. They had a special on their TV news network every single day. The update on the upcoming Ukrainian offensive. That's probably going to hopefully push the Russians into the Sea of Azov. And obviously, the Russians had months and months of time to build 3, 4, 5 layers of defense in depth, tank traps, trenches, barbed wire emplacements, pre-planned artillery strikes, everything like that. The Ukrainians hit it and I think 15 kilometers was the deepest they got.
Yeah, that's about the extent of it. They captured one minor city, which the
Yeah.
Russians have regained. Robotyne,
Chewed
I
up,
believe.
chewed up 3 of their best brigades and probably lost, who knows, anywhere from 5 to 8,000 men plus vehicles for nothing because you don't have surprise. If you're going to do something like that, man, you got to hit them with unbelievable, overwhelming force. If you're going to play that game, the ultimatum game, you better be the United States about to hit Iraq in 2003. Because remember, right, we gave Saddam an ultimatum. The Iraqis knew full well we were coming, but it didn't matter because here comes the entire U.S. military.
And to your to what you just said, Pete, I mean, one of the other principles, security. Never permit the enemy
Yeah.
to acquire unexpected advantage. Nothing like telegraphing where your punch is going to come.
Mm-hmm. I think also, again, deception plays into that. Deception, I think, feeds into a lot of the principles. Just always cloak.
Yeah.
Dude, it's just
So
Sun Tzu, man. Be subtle, be subtle. Use your
all
spies for
warfare,
everything.
all
All
warfare is
warfare
based
is
on
base.
deception.
All
I'd call
warfare is
that
base.
another theory, because that's because the whole point of the subterfuge, of deceptive operations. I don't even information operations.
What is it?
Yeah,
Maskurovka, if you
yeah.
want to use the Russian term.
The whole point is exactly to keep them guessing, so that you can maintain that element of surprise, or ruin their element of surprise. So in that way, yeah, surprise and security are kind of like back to back. Security, you want to ensure you don't have vulnerabilities, because surprises are never a good thing when they're happening to you. And then surprise itself, yeah. I I like to think of it as you're playing Dungeons and Dragons. You've got the big bad evil guy, and somebody's about to start dialoguing with him when your sneaky person hits them from behind with everything they got, with all of the combat multipliers and stuff before you've rolled initiative. You're just trying to schwack them before the fight even starts, because that's your best chance when their defenses are down. All right, so well, now you guys are spelling moose, like the chocolate one, not the animal. So we
I'm
got
dope.
mass, objective, unity of effort, unity of command, uh, security, and surprise. So, Pete, you mentioned economy of force earlier, and that'll at least
Hmm.
let us finish that word.
Yeah, we
So,
could at least spell out moose.
yes.
Chocolate mousse. So employ all your combat power. So economy of force, right? Be economical. Use parsimony. Use your combat power in the most effective way possible. Don't waste it, right? Especially the military. Again, this is not like business. When you use a resource in the military, it is oftentimes expended, never to be regained. Whether it is aircraft, tanks, men, experienced staff officers, when you lose them, you've lost them. And almost always the replacement is not as good as the original. The army you start the war with is oftentimes the, you know, higher quality in many respects than
Unless
what
you're
you end the war
America,
with. Unless you are America
pre World War II.
or also the British, in some ways as well. But right. However, if you're the Prussians, for example, especially, right, your starting army is your best army, and you want to try to maintain that edge as long as possible. Uh, what happened to the Wehrmacht during World War II is a very good example, right? Like they burned through their best officers and NCOs on offensive campaign after offensive campaign after a campaign. So, high speed lieutenants and captains who survived Poland and France maybe didn't make it through Yugoslavia and Greece, and they sure as heck didn't make it through year 1 or 2 on the Russian front. right? They either got promoted up to colonel and general or they died. And there's never enough to backfill. Never ever. So what you want to do is when you're using it, be frugal.
And every single military theorist that we've talked about on this show or anybody's really studied reserves.
Mhm.
You never commit everything you have all at once because you don't know what's going to happen. And this is where it gets really complicated, right? Because the other that other side of economy of force is you have more than one objective. Like in order to take that city, you might have to take out um, an airfield that's nearby it so that they can't fly their planes over you. And to take out that airfield, you need to make sure that their field artillery can't blow you up while you're assaulting it. So you might need to find a way to suppress their field artillery. So that's three objectives already packed into one. So assuming you guys have a larger army, then there's you now have to figure out how you're going to split up your forces in order to come after that. And that's the other way. That's the other conveyance of being economical with your force. How you have these people. How do you mass them where they need to be at the time they need to be there? And so you're trying to leverage all of these different principles all together to your advantage.
I like what you said about your first army is your best army, Pete. That's an interesting one. You look at Ukraine, I think that's true for both sides. The army that they went to war with on both sides is probably the most experienced combat effective force they could ever have. And I would argue that they're both desperately trying to regenerate manpower, but it's like the Lancaster square law, it's square cube law. It's like whatever
Mhm.
you do is going to be worse than you had before, and that's going to be just this law of diminishing returns from here on out.
Mhm.
Yeah, but until the middle of last century, though, the U.S. worked the opposite. We traded time for education. We played the
M
school of hard knocks. We
Maritime power though, right? So we're a maritime power. So
we our maritime power has always lagged too. But even
yes.
our military, like was Kasserine Pass. I remember that one from ROTC, where we got chewed up.
Defense of the Philippines, the largest surrender in American history.
Yeah, like we always get spanked the first time we step foot into these things, but we have the ocean in between us and pretty much anybody else, unless you're in a Red Dawn scenario. But we covered that one last episode,
Mhm.
and so we come back better, and we get them in the second half. And it was like that up until the Cold War when we were always in this heightened awareness ready state.
Do you think that would be true today, though, if we got into a modern conflict? I think in that case, in the case of the American military, the army you go to war with is going to be the best one you have at that point because you're
Right.
going to have to resort to conscription after that.
I think the
Yeah,
increasing complexity of the
but that'll be
of
pretty
war has
easy
definitely made that so.
when you can hand a bunch of Gen Zers living in mom's basement headsets to FPV from home, though.
That's fine. And again, that's just
How
the
much do you
army.
care about those conscripts?
I would say definitely, and also I would say it's World War II as well. So the Navy, that's right, right. The Navy you start the war with, that's the most powerful your
Yeah.
Navy will possibly be, unless you're the United States.
Unless the
Okay,
United States,
unless
yeah.
you're the United States, like Britain
Well, we don't
builds.
even have that industrial capacity we did in World War II
I know
anymore.
we don't.
We
I know we
don't.
don't. For example, Britain during World War II, you were telling me this, Matt, right? They finish one
Yeah,
battleship during
They
the
it's
don't
been
even
entire
two
war.
finish
They
one. The
don't even
Vanguard's
finish it.
not
two
completed
episodes ago.
intellectually.
The
Yeah,
Royal Navy in September 1939 is as powerful as the Royal Navy was ever going to be, and every single ship that the Kriegsmarine or the Japanese put down was irreplaceable. And so we need to actually look at it that way for us because we do not have the industrial capacity to support. It's
No,
kind of crazy.
absolutely
It's
not.
like, and I honestly doubt the Chinese do either, especially with a few well-timed strikes against their port facilities because it's so hard to build modern warships. So what we're going to have,
that's why we need to invest heavily in expanding our
it's like
littoral combat
two
ship fleet.
literally two glass cannons firing at each other and just seeing which one hits first before they both shatter.
So here you go, Pete. During World War II, the United States maybe built 1,200 major surface combatants. That's more than 3 times the size of the Navy today. Actually,
Well,
four
that's
times.
just disgusting, and I'm sure that's more than every other country combined by a massive margin.
Oh yeah,
I mean, the
including
Japanese barely built anything.
553 destroyers.
No, we sold them to everybody.
You want
That is,
you
and
want
again, that
merchant
is an
ships?
exception.
You want merchant ships, Pete? 2,751 merchant.
Hell yeah, man! Chester shipyards, baby.
Okay, well, so going back to Russia, Ukraine, and the principles conversation, though,
Mm.
the next one up in the chute is going to be your our other M, maneuverability. And this has been the biggest kicker, I'd say, for the Russia Ukraine conflict, because those first person view drones that you guys are talking about, the kamikaze drones and other drones, these are the most maneuverable, hard to hit platforms that anybody was seen. They were even we, as the United States, were not prepared to contend with these on a battlefield. Like we are completely redesigning our main battle tank because of these things, and other lessons learned from these most recent conflicts.
I would argue after the Kharkiv counteroffensive in the fall of 22, there's been no significant maneuver by either side on the battlefield.
No, I
Just
think, I
Well,
think
that's what I'm saying.
maneuver.
I'm arguing that the drones themselves constitute a new maneuverability aspect.
I
I
think
would
it's
agree
the.
with that. It's limited by their range, though.
I
Fair.
would say the drones are a piece of it. I would say modern air defense is the second piece of the puzzle. When you combine the drones and modern air defense, which prevents either side from gaining any kind of air superiority over any major part of the front line, then it paralyzes all troop and logistics movement to within 10 miles of the front line. And when you paralyze that, it kicks out one of the later principles, offensive, and as well as surprise. And all three of them together, it prevents anybody from gaining initiative or tempo. So you have
Uh,
to dig in and dig deep.
Air defense is the most insane anti-maneuverability game changer that
It
we have
paralyzes.
seen.
It absolutely paralyzes. Like when you say it, it looks a lot like the Miracle on the Marne, like 1914, right? The drones have the same effect that modern breech loading steel artillery had in 1914. The cavalry that was supposed to punch through was ripped to pieces by the artillery, and the air war had not developed to the point yet, or modern tanks, to counter that artillery. And so everything froze in place, just like the FPV drones, and you had to dig in because there's no way you could move up troops or supplies to achieve a breakthrough. And even if you did get a breakthrough, because you couldn't move up horses, which was the fast thing you had, everything that was broken through was at the speed of a man on foot carrying kit, just like in Ukraine. So even when you get a breakthrough, you just fall back 2 miles. Dude gets tired, dig in again.
Yeah, there's a huge comparison to be made between World War One and Ukraine and the same problems. I mean, you've added all these layers of technology, but the defense is beating the offense right now. And one of the principles of war is the offensive. And
Yep,
I would
that's our
say,
next one.
okay, I'm glad you're going there, Joe. The most effective and decisive way to attain a clearly defined objective. But yeah, if you
But
don't,
but guys, my copy of On War says that the defensive is the stronger form of warfare.
oh, we didn't adapt that part of Clausewitz, Pete. Just forget about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's something to be said for the home field advantage, right? Ukraine is still there right now.
Well, we did take the point where it says you need 3 men to take one if you're fighting a offensive battle. You need at least a 3-to-1 ratio. So we're already implicitly admitting that the defensive is by far the stronger form. We just don't like the, oh no, digging in is bad though, because the French did that in 1940 and look how it ended for them. But the Germans also did it in Italy in 44, and we couldn't punch through anywhere until the end of the war.
Yeah, Italy was a slog. People forget about that. Mark Clark and the Fifth Army really. I mean, you got to go to the Po Valley campaign in like April of 45 when the Wehrmacht is falling apart when they finally start to make progress. Otherwise, it's just one ridge line or one mountain range to the next, whether it's the Gothic line or all the different ones. I mean, for being a Luftwaffe general, Kesselring was pretty good at running a defensive operation.
Very, very capable. Also,
So,
Korea, to be honest, right? 52 to 53, Korea
yeah,
like
maneuver
barely
stops
moved.
after the end of 50. I mean, you kind of have some shifting around the 38th parallel, but there's really, it's just taken one hill or another. After 51, Korea's just Battle of Pork Chop Hill, Sugarloaf Hill, this ridge, this hill, that hill.
Just covered in freaking corpses, dude.
Oh, it's awful.
And that's
Yeah,
with like almost complete UN air superiority as well, which is crazy to
Doesn't
think
matter
about.
when the other people are willing to absorb
Yep.
massive amounts of
Hey, although
casualties.
so lots of volunteers. So yes, but the offensive, right? And I think again, people get it twisted. The offensive is only one of 9 principles, right? It's not just attack, just attack, just attack. Because if you're just going to feed men into the meat grinder, right, just for the sake of attacking, you've got Wagner and Bakhmut situation, right?
Right,
You
because economy of force.
mhm, right. All the principles balance each other.
Well, Wagner eventually took Bakhmut, Pete.
That's true. Or you could say Bakhmut took Wagner, to be honest, at the end of it all.
Well, just like the Germans eventually took Fort Douaumont near Verdun, but at what cost?
Mhm.
It is interesting that offense is a principle of war, but defense isn't, though.
I feel like we should rename it to either tempo, which I like mainly because of Generation Kill.
Tempo is a
Gentlemen,
principle of the offense,
we
though.
have allowed the enemy to dictate the tempo.
Tempo is considered a principle of offense.
Yeah, I know, but still, when they define offensive as seize the initiative, come on, man. Just give me tempo. I could fight a defensive with tempo and the initiative, just, a little backhand blow, a little fire brigade.
So, I mean, that was Sun Tzu's point with what we now call centers of gravity, though. You find the vulnerability and you control the tempo of the fight. And for that, you cannot be sitting back in a reactive stance. And I think that's the main issue with being with defense as a principle of war, right?
Mhm.
You can only not lose with a strong defense. You need an offense to win.
Playing not to lose. There's a football analogy.
America, the thing is playing not to lose. Sometimes it's the best way to fight under your circumstances.
Well, I'd argue both sides in Ukraine are playing not to lose right now. You don't really
Absolutely.
see any broad sweeping moves or grandiose, operations. There's no Operation Market Garden that's going to happen this year. There's no swing for the fences operation on either side.
They're waiting till November. It's very obvious. They're waiting
Well,
till
what
November.
happens in November?
Run out the clock.
Sorry, I just says
Well, not the elections, not any European elections, but an American election, right? The
and
American
so
election,
this
presidential election.
the last one we still have to talk about, which based off of our track record means we're going to end up talking about this one for 30 minutes for no reason, which is ironic because this one is simplicity.
It's also a really good one.
And it's just like the acronym KISS, right? Keep it simple, stupid. The more moving pieces you have, the more things are going to fall apart. I with the kids and I went to Legoland earlier in the week, or earlier last week rather, and they both got little Lego sets, which I had to put together. And the one with more moving pieces is definitely a bit more fragile. Yeah, the other ones that's Killian's go-to. That's Killian's go-to imagination ship. Simplicity. There is an art form to a strategy that is complex enough to maintain the element of surprise and to leverage these other principles of war, and yet maintain simplicity enough that it stays in sync with itself and maintains that synergy.
So, one of my favorite communists, Pablo Picasso, once said, "Learn the rules like a professional so you can break them like an artist."
That's an interesting quote.
Now, gentlemen, my question to you is, do the real masters of war know when to break the principles? So, like, one thing that came to my mind, right? Like, an old style principle of war was never divide your forces in the presence of a superior opponent, which Robert E. Lee did, like, all the time.
Yeah, I was
Well, he
about to
also knew he was
say, it was
facing
like
idiots.
define superior
Well,
opponent.
right. Here's the thing: it's like they don't know they're numerically superior opponent, right? So, like, Chancellorsville, yeah, no problem, Jackson. Take half the army and go marching off to the west that
Hooker's
way.
gonna just twiddle his thumbs anyways.
Look, he didn't know that. He was taking a big chance. He looks like a genius because it worked out, but still, right? At what level? And also, here's the thing. So let's take Chancellorsville, for example. Is Lee breaking the principles of war at Chancellorsville, arguably his greatest victory and
Yes,
the most stunning
absolutely
tactical
is.
But
victory
that's
in
you
American
can't
history?
say that you're breaking the principles though, right? It's you can't max them all out. That's not how character building works. So, like, you have to pick and choose, and you have to be lucky a little bit too, because you have to pick and choose which ones matter more at which time and in which place.
Or you can just blatantly disregard the majority of them, which I would argue is what led to the Chancellorsville. I mean, yes, he achieved mass, but he sacrificed the offensive. He had an objective, but he definitely didn't really have unity of command. He had unity of effort, but he had no. Once he sent Jackson off on his big left hook, he had no control over him. Had surprise. You could argue simplicity either way. You could argue maneuver. He couldn't maneuver his main force. He could only maneuver
He
Jackson's.
technically had security because the wilderness was so impenetrable.
What was a more economical way to use his folks?
Well, actually, yeah, because like, what do you consider the secondary effort? The hold.
Yeah,
So he gave
probably his
so he
blocking
gave so he
force
gave
where he was
Jackson the best
located.
core, and then he just let him go.
But
So okay, you're right. Actually, so okay, now okay. I'm seeing it the way Joe is seeing it. I figure this. It's like it's not rock paper scissors, but it's like I guess a game like it's like a card game where some beat others, and you have to kind of lay your cards out along the principal lines in a way that trumps the other.
Well, it's because that's the thing. I do agree at the fundamental level. Like, is he is is the principles of war even like a concept to generals during the American Civil War? I don't know. I'm actually not sure when, in particular, the principles of war were like formally codified or anything. I don't think anybody particularly plans strategies based around the principles of war, but you like also don't plan to throw a perfect pitch with gravity at like the forefront of your mind as the pitcher. You know what I mean? It's just there, and you're finding ways to use the air current to manipulate it and gravity at the same time to achieve the perfect ball placement on the perfect pitch.
No, I
That's
mean,
how
you're
baseball
discussing
works,
the
right? I
activity
I
of a
have not
of a
played
maestro,
for
right? This is
quite
someone who
some
has
time.
been doing it. War, baseball, whatever, art, it doesn't matter. When you've been doing it for your requisite 10,000 hours at least in Hearts of Iron 4 or what have you, right? You've become now such an expert that the rules, well, not the rules, but like the principles, all the undergirding elements are second nature to you. And you act almost on instinct. You would hope. So that's what Clausos would call the coup d'etat, right? The ability of the commander to immediately judge the situation and act appropriately.
'Cause risk is another thing that is not accepted as a principle, as it's not listed here as a principle. Accepting risk, understanding risk, it's an important element of waging war or conflict, but it's not there. And so I don't I don't think it's right to phrase it as, oh, they disregarded it or threw it out the window, because like you said towards the beginning of this one, Pete, it's a really helpful tool to analyze in retrospect. But there's no way to quantify which principle is more important than the other, because it's not even that easy to separate out which principle was the dominant influence at any point anywhere.
I'm reminded of a great quote from General Bernard. It's attributed to Bernard Montgomery. He was giving a lecture at the War College in Britain, and one of the students asked him if there were any laws of warfare. He said, "Yes, gentlemen, there are two immutable laws of warfare. Rule number one: do not march on Russia. Rule number two: do not march on China. Those, gentlemen, are the two laws of war."
never fight a land war in Asia, basically.
There you go. Never fight a land war in Asia, dude.
And never go in against a Sicilian when death is on
When
the
the death
line.
of war, right? So those are the laws of war. Don't start a land war in Asia. Very simple, unless you're Genghis Khan or Chinese and you live there. But the principles, the undergirding, it's like the music. It's like your notes, right? If you're composing a symphony of death and mayhem, which do you want to lean on more? Which chords do you want to link in? You can't just use the same three chords. You're not Taylor Swift. You got to be more creative. You got to use all nine. I really do like the music and art
Oh
parallel.
man,
Because didn't somebody important
we'd
say
get
like
so much hate mail about you bashing the Swifties if anybody actually listened to this podcast.
So I guess going back to what Joe was talking about earlier, are the principles of war still valid? Throwing it out there. I mean, someone might have argued after World War One that they weren't.
Do robots need to be added to it?
You need to factor in
I,
AI.
uh, I think again, like you were saying about 1914, you had robots were just layering more technological crap on the same problems that we're already
Yeah,
having.
I mean, one of the biggest proximate problems is like these principles of war were formulated pretty much based off of evidence before the air domain was even fully exploited, really.
Mm-hmm.
I'd agree
Because
with
like
that.
there have not been that many contested airspace conflicts since we started using the principles of war. So are the principles of war even sufficient to describe what we now call multi-domain operations? Air, sea, land power all mixed synergistically. Does that still work? In theory it should, because that's the whole idea of calling them principles, is that
Mm-hmm.
they're immutable and they should always change. But like how, right? Like these these things that cross so many lines that were just frankly inconceivable even a few decades ago, like the FPV drones blowing up. Like my understanding is most of the tanks that the US sent to Ukraine are still there and intact, but they've been shelved because there's just no point to using them because they are just so vulnerable to these cheap first person view drones.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, and
They're
120 ammo is a lot harder to come by than 125. But
right.
alluding to the thread you just pulled at, what about the Soviet principles of war? I pulled this up earlier. I
Ooh.
didn't have a chance to talk about it. The one that really sticks out to me, they have preparedness, initiatives, capability, cooperation, concentration, depth, morale, obedience. That's a great one.
I like
Steadfastness,
that.
Morale.
security, and then logistics. I think it's hilarious that the Russians could
The
talk about logistics.
beatings will continue until morale
Well, actually,
improves.
it's about
Well,
your
so,
opponent. The use of political and psychological factors to demoralize
oh
opponents and break their
wow.
will to resist.
Huh. That's
So
fascinating.
essentially,
So,
psyops.
Well, the thing is, the Russians can talk about logistics the same way Americans talk about objectives. It's a great idea. We really should get somebody on that. Yeah, we'll get right on that.
That's a great thing to
but
talk about.
Let's get back to the offensive.
Talk
That's
about
what
the
we're really. Yeah,
offensive.
let's get back. Let's see. Yeah.
so maybe the next time we revisit this segment and go back into another mill theory episode, I was planning we talk what we call the warfighting functions, and some of those seem like they might be a little bit more suitable. The warfighting functions is how we think about war on the ground. And they sort of line up a little bit better with those Russian
I like
principles of war.
obedience. Strict and uninterrupted obedience. Orders are to be obeyed exactly and without
Hey,
question. Commanders are
hey,
expected to directly supervise subordinates in a detailed manner
that's
in order to assure compliance.
discipline and obedience is number 5 on Sun Tzu's list of principles.
Maybe it's an Asiatic thing.
Maybe.
They definitely don't believe in disciplined initiative. I'll tell you
People
that
are really
much.
motivated when you're standing there behind them with a gun at their back, They always advance forward.
You do not understand the mind of a peasant. He is not fit. He is only to obey.
All right, Private Conscriptovich.
No,
It's like
no.
Alfred Lord Tennyson's Charge of the
No,
Light
no,
Brigade,
dude.
but super sad and depressing.
You mean Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade isn't sad and depressing?
Well, yeah, because the cannons behind them this time are your own cannons shooting at you. There's guns
Oops.
everywhere, and some of them
Ugh.
are our own bosses.
You think it's depressing now. You can always make it more depressing, Pete.
I believe Friedrich the Great said that the soldier should fear his officer more than the enemy.
Oh, the Russian soldiers definitely do.
They
Still.
most certainly do. Yes, and also, yeah. Well, actually, no. Similar to Friedrich the Great, their ranks are mainly full of the absolute scum of the earth. Convicts, soldiers of fortune, escaped pickpockets, the rest.
Well, got a letter in the mail,
Well, Lord
Yeah,
Wellington said the same thing about his British soldiers in Spain.
I'll do. Yes, the scum of the earth who have enlisted for drink. What a great line. Anyways,
If you'd like us to cover anything in particular, please feel free to reach out to us on some sort of social media or leave a comment on our podcast answering one of the questions, and we'd be happy to cover it for you.
and I'm always happy to apologize.
Tune in next week, or not next week, but the week after next, we will be doing Book Tactics, where we talk about either, if we have favorites, we'll talk about our favorite strategy war books. My particular case, I plan to just go on a rail about two very, very least favorite particular books
Oh,
that
I
I
wonder
have
what they
in
could
mind.
possibly be, Joe.
He's gonna be hating on Carl again.
Once an eagle,
No, it
message
was
to
actually
Garcia.
Pete. It was going
Oh,
to be
that too.
Antoine Meyer, Once an Eagle, and then
I
the other one I keep
I
going back
also
and
hate
forth
that
on
book
is Message
a
to
lot.
Garcia. I kind of waffle on how I feel about it. These
No, man,
days,
For
I
Whom the
feel
Bell
like,
Tolls is way worse. Not even a real war book. Also, All Quiet on the Western Front. Can't stand that one.
well, you know what? It's going to be all quiet on this podcast now.